And I've tried to show American studies, peace studies, how she fits in, where she fits in. That's what the book tries to show, why she matters as a musician and as a civil rights figure. Because she does matter. People must not write her off. She had a very, very important role to play, and she played it very well.
Elizabeth Thomson there, talking about Joan Baez. Now, before the interview with Elizabeth starts, about her biography of Joan Baez, The Last Leaf, please subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll get notice immediately when I upload a new interview. And don't forget, there are already many interviews on the channel that you can enjoy.
You're listening to Pop, The History Makers, with me, Steve Blame.
Welcome, Elizabeth Thomson, Liz Thomson, author, journalist, broadcaster, and interviewer. Well, you've published a number of books, beginning in 1980 with Conclusions on the Wall, New Essays on Bob Dylan.
Yes,
three widely praised,
young indiscretion.
Three widely praised anthologies on John Lennon, Bob Dylan, and David Bowie. And what we'll be talking about today, a biography of Joan Baez titled The Last Leaf. Now, apart from her own memoir, is this the only English language biography of Baez?
Yes, so far as I'm aware, there is a sort of German sort of monograph, I think, from someone's PhD. There's been a sort of French pictorial sort of mélange fairly recently. And of course, she's just in Berlin, actually. She's just been at the Berlin Film Festival. She's documentary has premiered, which has had very good reviews, I'd say.
Well, I want to start with you because as a child, you played guitar. You got a guitar from your sister, I understand.
That's right. Yeah. I was about 11, 10, maybe a bit younger. And I've been learning piano for quite a while. And my sister worked in Spain, and she brought home her boss to spend an English Christmas. And he stayed quite a long time. We had some riotous family fun. And not long after they returned, a package arrived from El Corte Inglés in Barcelona, and it was a beautiful blonde genuinely Spanish guitar. So I had to learn to play it. And in those days, there weren't quite as many now there are endless kind of easy chord books and so on. I mean, then if you went to the library, there were sort of classical guitar books, which I didn't want to learn. So I was sort of fumbling around, didn't really know what to do. And I found when I was back in Spain, I found in her record collection, she had the old radiogram upstairs, the new stereo was downstairs. I found Joan Baez Volume 2. It's a black and white cover. It was already about 1961, I think. So it was a few years old. And, the kind of selling point, I didn't know who she was. The selling point was it just showed this young woman with long dark hair, sitting in sort of dappled shade. And on the back of the album, she was holding what looked like a Spanish guitar. It's probably a Goya. Well, it was mostly quite straightforward. I could hear, oh yeah, that's three chords there, 1/4, dominant seventh minor, maybe a second minor. I could see how you could do that. So I kind of was able to learn stuff by ear. And then I found the Joan Baez songbook in the library, then more records. So I just began to learn. And because she had such fantastic phrasing, and she was a very good guitar picker, she was in that sense easy to learn from. So as I explored, it was she was sort of a Venn diagram through sort of bits of things that I sort of vaguely knew about in my sort of 12-year-old kind of brain. I'd go to Dobell's folk record shop and so on, and I found kind of interesting stuff that was kind of legendary. Eventually, this sort of Dylan Baez duets from Newport, and then a friend, my closest friend, bought me the old Folkways record of the March on Washington, which included full Martin Luther King's speech and Baez singing and various other, which I still treasure. If I want a good cry, I put it on. And of course that was fascinating because I heard of Martin Luther King, who only recently died, but I didn't particularly know about the March on Washington. So the music and her life became a sort of way to explore 1960s and 70s American history, which of course was preoccupied with Vietnam, with the civil rights movement. So I became really, I was fascinated by the music and by her, and I came to love her voice, especially on Joan Baez Volume 5, which has this amazing classical track on it by Villalobos. I thought, wow, she can really sing. But it was just, it was a way I just got further and further and further and deeper into American folk music in its broadest sense and history. So I was exploring Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Phil Oakes and Judy Collins, and and then as I sort of caught up with her life and got a bit older, and I earned a bit of money from Saturday jobs, and eventually from singing a little bit myself, I was buying all kinds of albums. I remember buying Diamonds and Rust, 75, and thinking, wow, Jessie's a great song. I mean, Diamonds and Rust is a great song, that's hers, but Jessie's a great song. Janice Ian, I haven't heard of her. So I went out and bought Janice Ian, and then that was another whole range of stuff to explore. So it's been, she started me, as I told her, on a sort of exciting and ultimately quite expensive journey. And that's that obsession that began, how old am I now? God, old, 50-something years ago, has remained with me. It's a real passion,
What did you understand about the complexities of her style by playing the guitar yourself?
But as a six-string guitar player, Baez was very, very good, and she continued to develop as a guitar player. I mean, if you look at what she, I think finally in the 80s, 90s, she started to have some guitar lessons. But if you listen to what she was doing, even on the last tour and from the kind of 90s on, I mean, really quite complicated sort of finger solo stuff, all the way up the fingerboard. And she was good at, there are a couple. I mean, "Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You," which is a song that obsessed friend Robert Plant, I think, got them going, where she does that amazing tremolo, which is very hard. I mean, I did learn classical guitar later on. It's very hard to sustain that kind of even tremolo, especially when you're singing as well, because you're thinking about all the stuff you're singing. And so her skill as a guitarist has gone largely unremarked, but it's not to be sniffed at.
When you were very young, your parents took you to a Joan Baez concert. How did that come about, and what was your experience?
Well, she was coming to do a concert at the Rainbow Theatre, which had recently opened in Finsbury Park, North London. She was doing 3 nights. It was quite a big deal. She was big news. She hadn't been for a while, I guess. And she was doing 3 nights, one of them with Mimi Farina, which I wished I'd also been able to go and see, but it didn't occur to me. I don't think my parents have taken me more than once. I mean, years later, I used to go to lots of nights. But anyway, I said, I really want to go. And my father, who grew up down the road from what was then the Astoria Cinema, and my parents lived over with his parents, but they got married after the war. You're not going there on your own. It's a rough area, but we'll take you. So they got tickets. And 18th December 1971. And actually, they loved the concert. And I was thrilled to see her live. And it was I suppose it was the first proper, it wasn't a rock concert, but I suppose it was the first concert like that I'd been to. The Rainbow then, I mean, it's beautiful again now, but it's owned by some sort of church, was a fantastic, Art Deco masterpiece with this sort of starry ceiling, and it had Joe's lights from the Fillmore East. So it was a very spectacular, it felt very cool. And I probably didn't appreciate how cool it was, or, I'm sure there was interested people there. So that cemented my obsession.
You said that Joan Baez became a Venn diagram that you explored. So what do you mean by that? And what did she actually represent for you?
That great sort of 60s, tumultuous 60s history was unfolding. And it was, horrible and violent, but it was very interesting. I just began, it wasn't anything we did at school. I just began exploring it on my own. So I was buying all sorts of books. I'd kind of lots of, she would reference something, but then I'd kind of, I'd read about Dylan, or I'd read about Pete Seeger, and something else would be referenced. So I'd go off and explore that. And in those days, of course, you went to the library or bought a book. I really studied quite hard. I got into it and had this whole second, interest that had nothing to do with what I was learning at school. I was just fascinated. The whole kind of New York, much of it just existed in my mind's eye. Certainly the village, the Greenwich Village, existed in my mind. This whole scene was in my mind's eye and ear long before I went there. But it was, I just had this great interest in Americana music and history. And I think what has always appealed to me, about songs that I first learned listening to Baez, but if you listen to Woody Guthrie or Pete Seeger, all those people, they were all, all those songs tell a story. And some of them told quite general stories about picking cotton or whatever, but some of them told very specific. I mean, certainly when you get to Dylan, they're telling very specific stories about who killed William Zanzinger and all, William Zanzinger killed Portia Carroll and so on. So it was I always think music, song, is a very valuable history lesson. It's a very easy way of absorbing all kinds of information and being sent off, down highways and byways to explore things that might otherwise pass you by.
Tell me about Baez's family, her parents and her grandparents, which were, in essence, a big influence on her.
Yes, I mean, she's, her mother was Scottish English. Mother was born in Scotland. So she has this sort of Scottish English blood. And on both sides, the father, of course, from Mexico, came to the United States as a little boy, first to Texas and then eventually to Brooklyn. And they were both her grandfathers were ministers, which of course she wrote about later on, which she wrote about a bit in Daybreak. Episcopalian on her mother's side. I found the church that her grandfather preached at, where he had a sort of community for a long time. It's now Spanish. It was the first Spanish Methodist church, I think, in the United States, in Brooklyn. And I found people there who remembered her grandfather and her grandmother. So it was a very active. So they were her paternal grandparents were very active in kind of Brooklyn community. They were very. Her grandmother was, and her grandfather was very active in trying to integrate, trying to make Spanish speakers feel at home. He wanted them to speak English, but he was very keen that they should not be second-class citizens, and he in fact engaged with President Roosevelt. Her grandmother sort of ran the choir and also, so very much, lots of these kids would not have had much, families would not have had much money. They started a summer camp for Hispanic kids up the Hudson Valley, or the Walker Valley, I think, just upstate New York. She obviously, and her maternal grandfather too, who was slightly more of a sort of raggedy life, I think, and was widowed and then several times married and so on. But she had on both sides, it was this very strong social conscience, pacifist, serious, and I'm sure a great awareness of the religion in its broadest sense. I mean, she wouldn't call herself religious, but I think she would agree that she's spiritual. And of course, what her father in his adult life came to was the Quaker church.
And she went to Quaker meetings with her parents, didn't she? So
yes,
what impact do you think that had on her?
Well, so her father, who was quite a renowned scientist, was, in the 50s, they tried to co-opt him on some, defense stuff, and he didn't have a sort of crisis of conscience. And it was her mother who said, let's go to a Quaker meeting in Buffalo. So they went to the Buffalo Society of Friends, taking Joan and her two sisters. And of course, the kids hated it, as I suppose most kids would. But she sort of went, I think, till she was 18, because she did what your parents told you, didn't you, in those days. And she probably wouldn't call herself a Quaker. I don't know, maybe she would think she's a Quaker still, but she certainly still keeps silence. I think all the tenets of the Quaker faith, the Quaker beliefs are really strong and really visible in her lives. And she still has lots of friends from within the Quaker community, the Americans Friends Service Committee, and of course a lot of the, clearly that, those beliefs discussed around the family dinner table, discussed on Sunday mornings, well, clearly had a profound influence on her still. I mean, they've kind of shaped her life.
You mentioned that her father was Mexican and she inherited his looks. When was she aware of her difference, if I can put it that way?
Oh, I think pretty early on, because of course she'd never, especially in Southern California, where, she was referred to as a dumb Mexican. And she's talked quite a lot about the fact that she was made to feel, she's the kind of, I met her, she's very like her mother as well, funny enough. She's like both parents in a bizarre kind of way. So she was made to feel different, and she did feel different. And the family moved a lot because her father didn't have tenure as an academic. So it was hard to find friends, hard to put down roots. So I think the period in sort of around Palo Alto, which is our sort of Stanford campus really, that was sort of happier, but I think Los Angeles, Southern California was definitely not, because there, you know, the Mexicans were sort of migrant fruit pickers or work, you know, they were migrant workers, like Woody Guthrie's song. You know. So I think she had a hard time, and what saved her was the guitar.
Her acts of civil disobedience started early. Can you sort of tell me about that, and also how her parents reacted to her?
Well, they started in high school because she refused to go home for duck and cover exercise, you know? And she said she'd read her father's textbooks. You know, she knew how long it would take to get from Missile to get from Moscow to high school, and she refused to Palo Alto, Palo High. She refused to, so she stayed in school. And I think her father commended the idea, but warned her against it because, of course, it was the era of kind of communism and Reds under the bed and all that, you know, and she'd be ostracized for doing so, which, of course, I think she was, you know, I think a commie. It was in the local paper, but that was her first act of civil movement.
I mean, she went to a Martin Luther King speech when she was 17, which had a huge impact on her. Can you tell me about the content of that speech and what it was?
Yeah, she went to a sort of youth conference. I think it was a sort of Quaker type youth conference at the cinema, which was on the Monterey, apparently very spectacular place still there on the Monterey Peninsula. And there, you know, I found people kids who remembered meeting her there. One woman was on the same bus that took them down to Monterey. And, you know, she played a, you know, completely inappropriate song, I think just a pop song. But there was King, as I suppose then still quite unknown, but speaking. I mean, how amazing is that to go to an event, you hear this, and then of course within, you know, no time at all, she's on the podium with him, and of course she was present with him certainly present at the March on Washington, which everyone really remembers. I Have a Dream, but she was with him on many other occasions in the South as well. You know, in Grenada, Mississippi, helping to take kids to a new desegregated school. Other places, you know, in that Birmingham, in that summer of what's known as the Birmingham summer, really. She was in Birmingham, Alabama, before the March on Washington. And, you know, the amazing thing about those two in concert albums from the very early 60s, which were her third and fourth albums, was that they were recorded on Southern campuses. You know, look at the credits. And you know, she had a nice old lefty, probably communist manager, Annie Greenhill, who her father had met on a anti-nuclear march in Boston. So they'd set up this recording schedule as she, you know, wended her way across the South to, you know, some really, you know, Miles College, Alabama, you know, Tuscaloosa, all these places. There were sort of way stations, you know, in the civil rights struggle. And none of the audiences had to be integrated. So, and as she kind of said after, a lot of black kids didn't know who she was, but, you know, there was this big concert on their campus, and of course, if white folks wanted to see her, they had to come on to black campuses. You know, many of these colleges were actually black colleges, so the white folks had to come on to a black campus. They had to buy tickets. They had to find their way. So you had sort of black people and white people sitting together in the audience. And, you know, now you think, yeah, so what? But I mean, if you think of 62, 63, it's pretty extraordinary. On one of the albums, you can sort of hear her a bit nervous, and then she says, "Well, should we sing We Shall Overcome?" You know, and they all sing, and you can sense that sort of, you know, presumably, I suppose not every white kid there was necessarily kind of, you know, on her wavelength, but I mean, who knows? But, you know, you could hear them all singing, and that's pretty amazing.
What sort of friendship did she have with Martin Luther King?
I think she was a pretty close friend. I mean, so certainly they you know, she was, you know, she tells a story about being sent in, I think it was in maybe in Birmingham, she was sent in to sing him awake. So he had to go and preach. He was, you know, fast asleep. So I think they were pretty close friends. I don't know to what extent they were in touch when, you know, she was on the road and he was on the road. But he did come to visit her with Andy Young when she was in jail for aiding and abetting the draft. So and he did that to make you know, obviously they were friends, but for King it was also making a statement, because King had, you know, it was difficult for him to come out against the Vietnam War. She and he had you know, something of a disagreement over that, as lots of people did, saying, Martin, you've got to come out. You've got to, if we can sort the war problem, if one problem's interlinked with all the others. I think they were pretty close friends. And if you watch her talking about him, there's a little documentary called King: The Wilderness Years, where she talks about him, and you see how profoundly moved she is. This very close up facial shot. You can see she's really, still very, very close to the surface for her.
I mean, you mentioned that she was at the, I think it was at the Lincoln Memorial when King did the I Have a Dream speech, and also Dylan was there.
Yeah.
There must have been immense positivity on that day. Did she talk about that and what she felt the future might be?
I mean, she talked about. I said what it was like. What was it like being on the podium? Next, because I mean, she was very, very, physically, as the crowd. I mean, it's not a huge space up there, and she always talked about. As far as I'm aware, he largely improvised the speech. He had a few notes, which is kind of pretty amazing to have sat there while he was doing that. I mean, she would never describe herself as an optimist. I mean, she would always say she's a realist. Was she? I mean, she would say that things are far worse now than they ever were in the 60s, when I think there was, at certain points in the 60s, there clearly was hope. And obviously the Civil Rights Act was passed, but then of course, they also had to contend with the Birmingham church bombing, for example, so there was there were lots of gruesome, however much hope they had, and obviously they did, everyone. The great triumph of the March on Washington, which was extraordinary, 250,000 people. The next month, 4 children were blown up in that Birmingham church bombing at Sunday school. So, it wasn't exactly an easy trajectory. But she has never given up. I mean, she's always, she says you have to, it's little victories and big defeats. That's what you have to embrace. It's not going to be, nothing's going to be an easy win, but you have to celebrate the little victories.
Has she ever talked about the political power of music, and when she first realized for her that she had a political power through her music?
Well, obviously, for the first couple of years, she was just singing folk. I mean, the most political song she sang was "What Have They Done to the Rain," which was Malvina Reynolds' song about nuclear rainfall. I think in early concerts, I don't think she said that much between songs. She was probably paralyzed by fear. Once she sang, she was all right, but she was paralyzed by fear. And then at a certain point, she learns to speak a little bit about social, political stuff. And then certainly by the time I saw her, she's, concerts were a lot of rapping and a lot of discussion of politics. All those singers that were coming up around the time of Dylan and sometimes in the wake of Dylan, they were phenomenal songs. If you think of Never for Fortune Again, which featured right through her career, there were powerful songs through which she could speak. And then, I think that it was to quite a great extent her meeting and then marriage to David Harris, who died very recently, was actually very important for her, because he was younger than her, younger than she. They met through the resistance movement. He founded this organization called Resistance, and they went on a speaking tour, and he'd speak, she'd sing across the country, which is documented in the film called Carry It On. And I think, so they were a power couple before Tom and Jane, really. But I think when you kind of see her before her marriage and then after, I think she learned a lot from being with David Harris and seeing him speak. He was at Stanford, he was a kind of scholarship boy at Stanford, very bright. And I think just being with him, and, I suspect she'd founded the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence very early on. So her reading was kind of directed by her first mentor, Ira Sandfeld, but then David Harris must have introduced her to a lot of other stuff. But certainly she learned to speak and be on the road and kind of engage in a somewhat different way, I think, through him.
How did she get introduced to the coffee houses in Cambridge?
Her father, it was the latest paternal move. He got a job at MIT. And so they moved across country, and they moved a lot. They've been all over the country. It was a very peripatetic childhood. And in Iraq. So the move to kind of frigid Boston was the latest move. They lived in Cambridge, across the river, and her father thought he'd take the kind of the family to a coffee shop one night to see. I think she says that he envisioned, what he wanted his kids to go to college, of course, but he envisioned this kind of intellectual dialogue. There were people playing chess, there were people discussing books. That's, I think he hoped it would be like a salon, and instead, all Baez saw was the guy under the yellow light playing Plaisir d'amour on his guitar. And that, of course, was the beginning of pretty early on in the folk revival. But obviously, Club 47, Cambridge was where she came of age, where that's where she made her name. But she was obviously a quick study because she learned guitar. That's where she was really learning guitar, was while they were living in Cambridge. And one of the people she learned from was Debbie Green, who was married to Eric Anderson. She went to Boston University allegedly to study drama. I'm sure she had no interest in it. Famously met Betsy Siggins and all the other people there at Boston scene. And instead of studying, she was goofing off every afternoon learning folk songs, playing around Harvard Yard. So it's a very intense, she's supposedly being a student, but it's obviously what she's really a student of is folk song, guitar, hanging around at all the clubs. And there were lots of them. Club 47 was the one she really put on the map, but Tuller's Coffee Grinder was the place that her dad took them all to one evening shortly after they'd arrived in Boston.
You mentioned Debbie Green. How important was Debbie Green to her career?
Well, she's somewhat controversial because there are people who say that, had it not been for Baez, Debbie Green would have been very celebrated and she'd have been famous and so on. I did find a small article by Debbie Green not too long before she died where she said that's complete nonsense. If I'd have wanted to push forward, I would have done so. I'd had asthma as a child. I was a big smoker. I didn't have a great voice. I didn't really. Now, it'll always be those who were. Joni Mitchell has said some pretty unpleasant things about Baez and taking Debbie Green's side, but Joni Mitchell said lots of bizarre things about lots of people. So, but I think Debbie Green certainly, as a person to learn from, was very important. And Baez has paid tribute to her when she died. She wrote a long tribute. So certainly the guitar technique and the repertoire, I think. And I think every young singer, they were probably all doing broadly the same songs, the ballads.
How pivotal was the Newport Folk Festival to her career?
Absolutely pivotal. So she'd begun to sing around Boston. She got her start in Club 47, $25 a night or something, and fairly soon there were kind of lines around the block. And then she went to the Gate of Horn in Chicago, which was Al Grossman's famous club, where Odetta had sang. Indeed, she met Odetta, who was a very important figure in all sorts of ways. She met Odetta at the Gate of Horn. So Baez had, I think, a 2-week residency at the Gate of Horn. And then the Newport Folk Festival came up, and Odetta promised Joan Senior, Baez's mum, that she and her husband would look after. They'd take her with them, and that they'd look after her, because she's very young. Remember, and in those days, 18 was still very young. So it was sort of agreed. Bob Gibson was the MC at the Gate of Horn, so she met him there. So it was agreed that he would introduce her. The Newport bill was full. It was the first Newport Folk Festival. The Jazz Festival was what people knew about. So the 1959 festival was the very first Newport Folk Festival. Bob Gibson was the MC, so it was agreed that he would, she knew she would come on stage, but it was an unannounced appearance. And, if you listen to the recording, which I'm sure you have, it is extraordinary because it's very, very exciting. We're crossing two very contrasting songs. Virgin Mary Had One Son, and we are crossing Jordan River, one languid and gentle, the other upbeat, real energy.
She said, in my book of destiny, the first page had been turned.
Yeah, so she was nervous as hell. And then when she came, there were 13,000 people there, which seemed like this huge audience. And she walked off the stage, and you can hear on the live recording the response is extraordinary. And then Robert Shelton, I think, gave the first mentioned over in the New York Times. The star was born at the first Newport Folk Festival. So then immediately people wanted to sign her up. Grossman wanted to sign her up. Grossman managed me to call Marion Dillon, of course, very soon. She didn't like what he was offering. She didn't like the big business. She went with Manny Greenhill, rejected CBS Records, went to Vanguard, which was kind of much more down-home, lefty, classically oriented. But she was, immediately she was in huge demand. So so that's Newport is July 1959. By 1960, she's really beginning to be on a roll. So when people say that, the Dylan nuts kind of try to say that she grabbed on his coattails. I mean, she was a name well before Dylan was. She got introduced to Pete Seeger's audience. She got to know Pete Seeger, and crucially, she also got to see how Pete Seeger had put the two parts of his life together. He was very committed, socially very committed. Of course, he'd been on the road with Guthrie. He knew he was part of an older generation of the folkies, but he had this life of great social commitment, and that sort of showed her that was possible. She didn't have to kind of buy into the star system that Al Grossman was sort of dangling for her. She could, and she was, partly she was frightened of it, I think, but she also didn't want it. She wanted, it sort of was antithetical to her sort of Quaker religious upbringing. She felt it was wrong to buy into that sort of glitz and glamour. And she has said also that, she earned a fair amount of money quite quickly, which her family had difficulty with. They'd never had money as a family, and which she had difficulty with, I think. And then, on the cover of Time magazine.
And also, she was still young. She was a woman in a male-dominated industry, and in an industry that ripped off everyone, whether they were female or male. It didn't really matter in that era. So, was she business savvy in any way?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think she signed quote unquote with Manny Greenhill a handshake. I think that was all he ever had. Manny's been dead a few years now. I know his son, who's still in the music business. Manny Greenhill had, I think he looked after Paul Robeson, after Pete's illness, and also he was working with Pete Seeger after he was blacklisted, getting him back on the road, getting him to concerts. And he's always bringing all these black artists up from the blind black singers. He was got more passports for all these people to go on tours. So Manny Green. So she signed with a guy, or shook hands with a guy who was very committed, not to making money, but to the music and to the kind of political principles. But I don't think, to your question, was she business savvy? No, I don't think so. And I think she probably didn't want to be. And I think she did say at some later stage when money was, for a long time, money came in, so she could buy it. She had a phase of buying friends' cars and all sorts of stuff. Probably not saving, probably not being wise, but, she didn't kind of know about money, and she wasn't much interested in it. She signed the Vanguard record royalties were all signed over to charity quite an early stage. And they're probably the only records that have really earned a huge amount of money, I would guess. But, she wasn't interested. She didn't want to feel she wasn't in it for the money, but she didn't want to feel that money was a priority. It clearly wasn't, and that wasn't Manny's priority either. And Vanguard Records, which was run by two brothers whose interest was classical music. I think they did the Pete Seeger, the Weavers Carnegie Hall concert, Robeson. Again, that was the attraction. Probably paid less, probably no big advance. Obviously, Marie always says they ripped her off. Who knows? Every record company ripped everyone off. Jack Holtzman ripped everyone off at Elektra, I think. So, who knows what she made? I don't suppose she paid that much attention.
Tell me about her relationship to Dylan and the stages within that relationship and how it related to the music.
Well, they famously, they're introduced at Gerde's Folk City in New York. They meet. He's a very unformed talent. She's already a star, so she would not want to use that term, I suppose. And then, she hears the songs between Manny and Grossman. They get the songs, there's lots of demos. So she recorded the songs, and then, obviously they become much more friendly. And of course, they sing together first of all at the Monterey Folk Festival, I think, on the West Coast in about May '63. And then they sing together. So then at Newport, 1963, she returns the favor that Bob Gibson, gave to her. So she brings Dylan on. So he arrives, as Shelton says, at sort of underground conversation piece, and he leaves Newport a star. So she brings him on stage. He brings her on stage. They're in workshops together, and then of course, he breaks up with Susie, and they're a kind of an item, and I think that, who knows, she obviously did love him. I mean, I think she said time and again that he sort of broke her heart. I think she said it recently in this film, and he really did break her heart. And then they played a lot. So, but she then, professionally, she brought him on stage at the Hollywood Bowl, at Forest Hills. She shared her platform with him, not always to great joy from her audience. But she gave him, if you think size of the Hollywood Bowl or Forest Hills, that's a big audience. So he's done Newport, he's beginning to be unknown, he's known amongst the folky crowd, and then she gives him this platform. And then of course they plan a tour, which doesn't really happen. And she goes to London, and it seems to be all lovely, king and queen, folk queen, reigning prince, all that stuff that the fan magazines wrote at the time. And obviously they had a relationship, and he spent time with her in California. Songwriting, I mean, she apparently tried to get him to look after himself, allowed him space to write. It was clearly, there are pictures of him out there, clearly that was an important time. And then, of course, they come to London in 1965 on the Don't Look Back tour. He doesn't invite her on stage, she's not played here before, and it ends really badly, and I think it did break her heart. It wasn't very healthy during that period. She had this idea, I think, that he would be an activist as she wanted to be on the barricades, which of course he wasn't really, apart from the March on Washington. She learned eventually that wasn't his style. He would write the songs, but he didn't want to. So it didn't end well. But then, of course, 10 years later, he calls her up and asked her if she'll join the Rolling Thunder tour. And of course, Diamonds in Rust, her most famous song, chronicles the phone call and the kind of, looks back. I mean, it's a fantastic song. Bittersweet romance.
Diamonds and Rust lays bare her emotions. Has she ever talked about that song in retrospect?
Yeah, well, mostly to say that, she was working on something else and Dylan rang and they had this conversation, and then it just poured out, from somewhere very deep. And she said, I mean, she's right. It is her best song by a very long way, most celebrated song. And everything about it, the poetry is good, that very distinct guitar riff, the kind of the synthesizer that wails like a banshee in the full moon that you mentioned. It's a really good song, and it encapsulates their relationship. But it is very bittersweet. And it's all there. You burst on the scene already. You're a legend. You said my poetry was lousy. You said, I mean, it's an extraordinary song. The Crummy Hotel over Washington Square, which is the Hotel Earl, now the Washington Square Hotel. It's an amazing song, but it came just kind of welled up out of it.
She was arrested during her life through her political activism.
Yeah.
Was she ever in danger from government forces or from the establishment for her activism?
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, yeah, she spent 2 periods in jail. I imagine that she was a pain in the ass to the American government. But I mean, she was seriously, actually in physical danger, I think, was in Christmas '72. She went to Hanoi, guest of a sort of international control commission. I mean, supposedly there was a ceasefire. There's not going to be any bombing. And she went with a Nuremberg prosecutor and minister, a church minister. And she was taking letters to prisoners, and the idea was they would see what was going on. And then suddenly, the Christmas bombardment started, and she was trapped there for a couple of weeks. 18 days, was it? Something like that. And I think that must have been a pretty dangerous time, because it was the heaviest. I think statistically, it was the heaviest bomb. Whether it's been succeeded by Ukraine, I don't know. It was that time. It was the heaviest bombardment in history. aerial warfare. So that must have been a pretty frightening time. And she was obviously deeply, some pictures of a film of her when she comes back and begins to talk. She wrote about it extensively. She talked about it. She recorded an album in the bomb shelters, which doesn't make pleasant listening, but I think, Where Are You Now, My Son is a very powerful document. It's it uses air raid sirens. You hear women crying, and then overlaid is this poetry in her. Most of it's spoken with a sung chorus, which is Where Are You Now, My Son. So I think that was pretty dangerous. And then in the 80s, she went to Latin America, during the sort of high watermark of dictatorship. And of course, she was, I think she wasn't officially banned from singing, but in reality, most of the concerts couldn't take place. And there were bomb threats, I think, Argentina particularly. But so she sang, she just did concerts where she could, amongst, and she let mothers disappear. I mean, I think there were kind of distinct threats there, and I think that was probably a very dangerous trip for her. And then she went in, more recently she was to Sarajevo. She was the first singer, first entertainer to go in, taken in by George Soros when the city was still under siege. And there's remarkable footage actually of her, being zipped into her flak jacket and bundled into a car and then kind of being taken around and then meeting the cellist in Sarajevo. And she gives a street concert and participates in the performance of Hair that ran throughout the entire siege, I think. And just going, visiting people in hospital. I mean, she was there for, I can't remember how many days she was there, but it was, again, I mean, that was, that was a very dangerous war zone.
What do you think her legacy is in terms of, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, and in terms of her contribution to music?
Well, she's only, she didn't really identify as a feminist, I don't think, when she first met Gloria Steinem. They sort of, and much more recently when they met, she sort of had said to her, I didn't quite, I didn't kind of understand this feminist stuff. But of course, by just, as you touched on earlier, because she was, she wasn't that strong a woman. In fact, she was having lots of anxiety, but she appeared a strong woman. And there she was, she was one of the few women, there were pop stars, obviously, but she was one of the few women doing what she was doing out there on her own. So in that sense, she was a symbol for women. And there's a survey called the Woodstock Census, which showed she's one of the most, even among guys, she was one of the most influential women of the period. She's way up there. Second, she's happiest when the music and the social action come together, clearly. But for much of her life, her music career was secondary, which is why it suffered so badly in the 70s and 80s, because she didn't pay it any attention. And then the last bit of her career, because she had to concentrate on it rather more, so she could go out at a time for her choosing. But I think she's always, she would say that music doesn't change the world, but you can bring people together. You can bring them joy. You can bring them joy. If you're under siege in Sarajevo, you can. It's a galvanizing force. And she said there's no kind of social movement without music that's worked. She's not saying that music changes the world, but music is an important part of any movement. She was deeply unfashionable for a long time, and no one in the 70s and 80s, kind of certainly later 70s and 80s, who, what, no one knew who she was. Certainly when I was listening to her in the 70s, and my classmates were listening to David Cassidy and the Osmonds and all that, Bay City Rollers. I was kind of really weird going home and listening to Baez and then Cohen and Janissi and all that stuff. And then she dropped from view really in the late 70s and 80s. She Rolling Thunder brought her some visibility, but then she in the 80s and she almost gave up. I remember interviewing at the end of the 80s when she said, I thought this was it. I thought I'd give up. And at the end of the 80s, she was saying, I want to go out at a time of my choosing. I've got maybe 5 years or so or whatever. And as I said when I met her in 2018, well, you weren't even half done in 1989, as it turned out. But I think people have, the younger folkies since they've learned to appreciate. Her last manager, Mark Spector, was very clever in putting her on tour with people like the Indigo Girls and Mary Chapin Carter, young musicians who were coming up. Josh Ritter, who knew who she was, whose families probably knew who she was. She said the first time someone said, my mother has all your records. I wanted to punch them out, you know. But so, you know, she came together with a group of younger folk acts who did know her music because it'd been there in the kind of family, you know. Josh Ritter told me that when he told his mum, you know, he was going to be touring with Baez, she was beyond thrilled, you know. So she began to, you know, she had to persevere, play small venues, kind of find a way up again. And then people, I think, are beginning now to recognize that she played a very significant role. I mean, the voice is fantastic. She was a very significant guitar player. It is intriguing when people like Robert Plant pop up and talk about how he heard her. So I think when the history of this period is finally written, when we're all gone, people will see her as a very influential figure. And like, you know, I think when she leaves this earth, I hope not for a very long time. She's 82. I think that people will look back and realize what a significant role she played, because, you know, she didn't care about being popular. She cared about doing what she believed to be right, and that's still what she does. And now she's retired from the stage. You know, she's painting mostly, and she's using her art to raise money for causes. You know, there's money that's gone to Ukraine. There's money that's gone to Stacey Abrams' campaign in Georgia. There was money that went in honor of John Prine. You know, she's still doing, in a different way, she's still doing what she's done for 60 years.
Your life has been, sort of basically intrinsically linked to Joan Baez, and you've met and interviewed her a number of times.
Yes.
And you mentioned the story about Maureen at the beginning of the interview, your sister, who gave you your first guitar, which was the lead into you getting to know Joan Baez. And you went to a concert with Maureen.
I thought of going to Paris to see her, but timing didn't work particularly. And I thought, well, the last concert, that's the one I should go to, the very last concert. So I kind of rang my sister. I was in New York and she was in Malaga. And I said, do you want to come and see Joan Baez? It's the very last concert. You know? So she said, oh, well, you know, I don't want to away to Madrid for one concert. So I said, well, I'm offering you, you know, I think we have a nice few days, sisters together in the hotel, and you know, it was your, you know, she said, I said, you know, it was you who started this journey with the guitar and that record. You never told me. So I said, yes, I did. Lots of times, you know. So I said, well, it'd be nice to complete the circle. You said, oh, all right. And yeah, okay. So, you know, I booked and we met in Madrid and stayed at the Hotel Opera just because it was convenient, but turned out to be the hotel that Baez and the band were staying at, because right by the stage door. So, you know, we had this nice time in Madrid and we saw this last concert, which was very emotional. And then I came back and finished off my book, which is dedicated to Maureen, and she saw a proof, but she didn't live to see the book came out. She died very suddenly in Spain during COVID. So, I mean, Maureen had no particular interest in this music, really, but it happened. She had someone had given her this record, which she had no recollection of, and then her boss bought me this guitar, and there it was. So anyway, the book remains dedicated to her.
The book it's a fascinating read. I think it's told with real love and affection.
No, I don't delve into her love life. That's not the purpose. It's to try and show what, you know, the Venn diagram. I've tried to show how she fits into not just to music, but into kind of, you know, American studies, peace studies, how she's part of the late 20th century. That's what the book tries to show, where she fits in, why she matters as a musician and as a civil rights figure, because she does matter. And people must not write her off. You know, you could not like her voice, but they have to recognize she had a very, very important role to play, and she played it very well.
Elizabeth Thomson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews, and here is where you can connect.